Some stories don't begin with a smile, a spark, or a chance encounter. Some begin in silence, in the stillness after loss, in the slow ache of mornings that come too soon, in the long shadows cast by empty chairs. This is one of those stories. It starts not with joy, but with absence, not with hope, but with the remnants of it scattered like photographs in an attic, untouched, fading. It's a story of love so quiet it went unnoticed until it was gone, of time passed too quickly, of holding on when letting go would be easier. And yet there is beauty in the breaking, a certain grace in falling apart if only to learn how to rebuild again. Not as it was, but as it needs to be. This is the story of a man who lost everything, and somehow found something greater in the ruins. He had always loved the sky. Thomas Ward never felt truly alive on land. Gravity never suited him. As a child, he'd lie on the grass in his mother's backyard for hours, watching silver-bellied jets carve delicate lines across the heavens, dreaming of the day he'd be up there, guiding one himself. It wasn't just the idea of flying. It was the distance, the detachment. Up there, above it all, life seemed quieter, cleaner, less confusing. Now at 29, he sat in the co-pilot seat of Flight 237 bound for Denver. He had done this dozens of times. The checks, the chatter, the calm voice of air traffic control like a familiar hum in his ears. It was routine, professional, controlled. But something felt different that morning. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as they began cruising at altitude. Outside, the sun was cresting over a sheet of clouds, casting a warm gold across the horizon. Inside the cockpit there was a moment of stillness. No alarms, no turbulence, no chatter, just quiet. Thomas glanced at the small photograph he kept tucked beside the control panel. A worn image of his mother, sitting on the porch swing in her old cardigan, her hands folded in her lap, smiling that soft, familiar smile that had once been his entire world. He had meant to call her the night before, but duty had a way of stealing time. There was always one more flight, one more checklist, one more delay. He had promised himself he would make time tomorrow, but tomorrow, he didn't know, would never come. So he did the only thing he could. He wrote. He pulled out a scrap of paper from his flight log and began scribbling words not meant for flight logs or reports, not for black boxes or official records, just for her. He wrote as the plane soared westward, his pen barely keeping up with the swell in his chest. He wrote what he never said, about the sacrifices she made when he was too young to understand, about the nights she skipped meals so he wouldn't go to bed hungry, about the way she never remarried because, in her words, one great love, even one that ended in a folded flag, was enough for her. He wrote about the guilt he carried, for leaving home too soon, for chasing skies instead of staying grounded where she needed him. He told her he saw her in every sunrise, in every landing, in every silent prayer before takeoff. He thanked her for her patience, her strength, her absolute, unwavering belief that he was meant for more than the small town they came from. His handwriting wavered near the end. There was no turbulence, only the weight of the words pressing down on the page. Words he should have said years ago. Words that would now, maybe, be found folded in the corner of his flight manual. Words that someone, some stranger, might deliver to a front porch swing in a cardigan that still smelled like home. At 9:42 a.m., the aircraft encountered a systems failure no one could have predicted. Alarms lit the cockpit like fireworks. The calm was gone. The sky was no longer soft. But by then, Thomas had already folded the note neatly and tucked it between the pages of his flight journal. He had kissed the photo of his mother with a glance, not knowing if the next moment would come. The training took over. The commands, the focus, the impossible decisions. He stayed steady. He stayed calm. For the passengers, for the captain, for her. And somewhere far below, a mother made her tea and sat on her porch swing, unaware that the sky was holding her son for the last time. When the first news alert hit the television screen, it was quiet. In a modest kitchen tucked into the hills of southern Missouri, an old kettle hissed to a boil, and the television hummed softly in the background. Martha Ward, now in her late 60s, moved with the slow grace of someone who had learned to make peace with waiting. She wore the same wool cardigan she always did in the cooler months, the one Thomas had bought her with his first real paycheck. It was too warm for it that day, but she wore it anyway. Some habits were never meant to be broken. She didn't hear the first report, or the second, not until the name of the airline echoed into the quiet room like the faraway rumble of thunder. Then came the flight number, 237, and everything inside her stilled. The mug slipped from her hand and shattered on the tile. The kettle screamed into the silence. The days that followed blurred together like raindrops sliding down a window. Reporters camped outside the house. Officials called. Neighbors brought casseroles and sympathy in mismatched Tupperware. But Martha didn't cry. Not right away. Not until she was alone with the silence. She sat for hours at the edge of Thomas's childhood bed, running her fingers over the model airplanes still lined up on the shelf, untouched for years. She traced the letters of his name carved into the wooden desk, a boy's scrawl, uneven and proud. She stared at the sky from his bedroom window, waiting for a sign, waiting for anything. Then, on the fourth day, the package arrived. It was small, unassuming, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address, only an official seal and the words "Personal Effects" stamped on the front. Her hands trembled as she opened it, careful not to tear the edges. Inside was a worn, leather-bound flight logbook, creased and weathered by years of use, and inside that, folded with deliberate care, was the note. Not typed, not formal, not part of any report, just ink on paper, just her son. She read it once, her eyes burning but dry, then again, and again. Each word was a wound and a balm at once, the kind of letter no mother ever wants, yet every mother prays will come if the worst should happen. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't perfect, but it was him. He had written of her sacrifices, of her strength, of how every time he took to the skies he carried her with him, not in memory, but in essence. He had apologized for leaving too soon, and for all the birthdays missed, all the holidays marked by static phone calls and time zones. He had thanked her for believing he could fly before he ever truly knew how. And near the bottom of the page, in smaller handwriting, almost hesitant, he had left a single sentence that broke her. "If anything ever happens, just know I never flew alone." That night, for the first time, Martha cried. She cried not for the tragedy, but for the beauty in his final gift, the way he had reached back through the dark and left her a light to hold on to. Not in the form of ashes or medals, but words. The last honest breath of a life lived in motion. A son who had known, somehow, that the sky might one day keep him, and who made sure his mother would never feel left behind. The media would come and go. Investigators would draft reports and label the cause of the crash with sterile mechanical precision. They would talk about electrical failures, black box data, and final descent angles. But none of those things would ever explain the ache of an empty porch swing or a silence too heavy to bear. What the reports could not say, what they would never capture, was what the sky remembered. Because the sky did remember. In the quiet hush of a morning wind brushing across a treetop, in the long trailing contrail of a plane passing overhead, in the hush of cloud shadows moving over fields. The sky remembered Thomas Ward not as a statistic, but as a soul it had once carried, one that had whispered love into its currents and left behind something more permanent than fear. His note in time would be framed on the mantel, read by relatives, held by grandchildren too young to remember his face, but old enough to feel something in their chest when they heard his name. It would not be his voice they remembered, but his message, his final act, one of grace, not fear, of love, not loss. And his mother, broken, yes, but never bitter, would step outside every evening as the sun began to fall, looking up into that endless stretch of fading gold, and she would whisper his name, not to the wind, but to the sky itself, because the sky always answered. Grief is strange. It doesn't arrive like a thief in the night or a storm on the horizon. It creeps in, almost politely at first. A soft chair left empty, a second cup of coffee poured, then left untouched. A name almost spoken, then swallowed back into silence. And then one day, it spills over, and once it does, it touches everything. The town of Maple Hollow was small, but it held memory well. Thomas Ward had grown up among those fields and fences, in a place where everyone knew each other's story and most had some version of his boyhood frozen in time. The lean kid who fixed bikes, helped neighbors shovel driveways, ran down dirt roads chasing summer storms. They remembered him the way small towns remember their own, with pride and with a pinch of pain when tragedy calls. When the news came, it swept through the town like cold wind through cornfields. People didn't know what to say. They brought casseroles, offered rides, sent flowers and cards with carefully chosen words. Words that tried, but failed, to wrap around something so senseless. And yet, it mattered. The kindness, the presence. It kept the world from falling completely apart. The local church held a memorial. Not a funeral. There were no remains, only memory. The pews were full. Photographs of Thomas lined the entryway. Him as a toddler, face covered in birthday cake. As a teen, all legs and nervous grins in his ROTC uniform. And as a man, crisp in his pilot's gear, calm-eyed and quietly proud. There were no speeches, no long eulogies. Just music, just silence, and the slow sound of people weeping without shame. Martha sat near the front, her hands folded in her lap, holding the letter he wrote as if it were a fragile relic, sacred and alive. She didn't speak that day. She didn't have to. Her silence said everything. Outside, after the service, people lingered beneath the oaks that had stood longer than memory. Children played at the edges of the crowd, not understanding the weight in the air, but feeling it all the same. Someone pointed upward as a single plane passed overhead, a distant hum tracing the sky like a thread through fabric. For a moment, no one spoke. Eyes lifted. Hearts broke again, quietly. Later, a few old neighbors offered to mow her lawn. The postmaster delivered her mail to the porch instead of the box. The grocer started setting aside her favorite bread without being asked. These were the rituals of shared sorrow in a town like this. They couldn't bring him back, but they made sure she didn't feel left behind. And then, gradually, time passed. Not in the way it does in stories, all at once, leaping to something new, but slowly, day by day. The seasons shifted. Winter crept in with heavy skies and wind that whistled through the porch beams. The swing out front stopped moving, frozen in place. Martha would sit by the window in the evenings, Thomas's letter in her lap, watching planes cross above like silent messengers. Some days she'd imagine which one might have been his, if time had been different. She never remarried. She didn't sell the house. She didn't change the furniture or move his model airplanes from the shelf. But something inside her began to shift. Not to heal, not exactly, but to open, like a cracked door that lets in the morning light. One spring morning, she pulled a box from the attic. Old journals, photographs, flight school mementos. She laid them all out across the kitchen table and began putting them into a book. Not for herself, but for the children in the family. For the nieces and nephews who would grow up never knowing the sound of his laugh or the quiet way he entered a room, but who might one day read his words and understand the kind of man he was. She included the letter, the original, not a copy. She wanted them to feel the weight of the paper, the curve of his handwriting, the imprint of his final thoughts. She wrote nothing of the crash, only of the boy who had once told her the clouds looked like mountains for angels to rest on. It wasn't closure. There's no such thing when you lose someone mid-sentence, but it was something else. A way of saying, he mattered, he lived, he flew, and he loved. Because the ripple left behind by a good soul doesn't fade. It changes shape, it moves outward. It finds new hands to hold it, new hearts to feel it. His message, a simple handwritten goodbye, had become more than a farewell. It had become a legacy. In Maple Hollow, they never forgot Flight 237. But more than that, they never forgot Thomas Ward. Not because of how he died, but because of how deeply he lived. Years later, long after the world had moved on, a boy sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, holding an old, weathered letter. He was 12, with his uncle's quiet eyes and the same curious restlessness that had once stirred in Thomas Ward like wind waiting to lift wings. The boy didn't fully understand the weight of what he held, not yet, but he knew it mattered. He could feel it in the paper, in the silence his mother kept when she passed it to him, in the way his grandmother had taken it out of a velvet box as if unsealing something sacred. He read every word, and though he had never met Thomas, something in him shifted. That boy would go on to become a pilot. Not because he wanted to be like someone in a story, but because the story felt like it already lived inside him. Because every time he looked at the sky, he felt not fear, but longing. And because that final letter, that act of quiet courage, had given him more than a name to carry. It had given him permission to follow the same stars. At flight school, the boy, now a young man, kept a folded copy of the letter in his logbook. Not out of superstition, but out of respect. It became his ritual. Before each takeoff, he would press his hand to the page, as if greeting a ghost who had once sat where he now sat. As if reminding himself that flying was not just machinery and calculation, but memory and meaning. In a strange way, Thomas never really left the skies. He lived in the small sacred routines passed between pilots, the final cockpit check done in silence, the subtle nod before liftoff, the moment of stillness before descent. His story traveled in whispers among those who understood that flight is not just about reaching a destination. Sometimes it's about carrying someone else's journey just a little further. And back in Maple Hollow, Martha Ward grew old, but never empty. The pain softened as time has a way of doing, but never fully disappeared. It curled into quiet corners of her life. A pair of boots never moved from the front hall, a voicemail she never deleted, a birthday candle never lit, but in its place came something gentler, a sense of peace, of presence. Every year, on the anniversary of the crash, she would go to the small memorial stone set beneath the oak tree at the edge of town, the one the neighbors had placed there, carved with his name and a pair of wings, and sit for an hour, not to mourn, but to remember, and to thank him, silently, for the letter that had carried her through the darkest night of her life. In time, others would come, passengers' families, strangers who had read about the note. A woman who had once sat in 14C on a different flight and had remembered the calmness in his eyes. A retired captain who carried survivor's guilt heavier than any briefcase. They came not for closure, that was a myth, but for connection. They left flowers, stones, paper airplanes with messages written on the wings. They came because they, too, had been changed. The crash of Flight 237 would be studied, documented, archived, its cause determined, its lessons logged in flight safety protocols. But what lived beyond those official words was something much harder to trace, something more human. It lived in the ripple of one man's final act of love. A letter, never intended for the world, that found its way to countless hearts. A reminder that even when time runs out, grace does not. That when faced with the end, we can still leave behind something whole. On her last birthday, Martha sat once more on her porch swing, wrapped in that same old cardigan, the letter folded neatly beside her. The sky was soft again, streaked with orange and lavender, the kind of sky her son would have flown through with reverence. She looked up, her breath slow but steady, and let her eyes follow the faint trail of a passing plane. She smiled, a smile lined by age, but still carrying the full weight of a mother's love. And somewhere above, far beyond what eyes could see, the sky held its quiet answer. Because the sky does not forget the ones who loved it. It carries their weight, their stories, their last messages home. And when it calls back, it does so gently, like wind through leaves or the faint rustle of wings, not an ending, just a return.